Stories from the home front bright, keeping victory shining light on the victory home front.
When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, most Americans expected a difficult struggle, but few imagined just how long and demanding the conflict would become. By 1944, the war had already lasted for nearly 3 years for the U.S. Millions of Americans had been serving overseas for long periods of time, families had spent years separated from loved ones, and children had grown up with fathers far away. Letters from soldiers arrived weeks after they were written, sometimes months. The waiting never seemed to end, and although victories were beginning to appear, the war still felt enormous and uncertain. Hello to all the Rosies and Homefront Joes, and welcome back to On the Victory Homefront as we wrap up this 5-part series, The Battle for Morale, World War II Homefront Under Pressure. Because when we imagine the American homefront during World War II, the picture often seems clear and inspiring. Factory whistles are blowing as workers pour into massive plants producing tanks and aircrafts, women stepping into industrial jobs as Rosie the Riveter, families planting victory gardens in backyards and city parks, and communities saving scrap metal and rubber to support the war effort. The story we often hear is one of unity and determination, a nation fully mobilized and standing together. And in many ways, that story is true. But the reality of wartime America was much more complicated. Behind the patriotic posters and radio speeches, the American homefront faced enormous pressure. Morale was constantly tested. Fear, exhaustion, social tensions, shortages, and even enemy propaganda all threatened to weaken the national spirit the war effort depended on. Throughout the series, we've explored many of those pressures. Enemy propaganda trying to plant doubt, the emotional weight of casualty telegrams, the daily frustrations of rationing and shortages, and the tensions and divisions that erupted in American cities. But by the later years of the war, another challenge began to emerge: exhaustion. After years of sacrifice, many Americans were simply tired. On the home front, the demands of wartime production were relentless. Factories operated around the clock. Workers produced tanks, bombers, ammunition, ships, and vehicles in staggering quantities. Many workers labored 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Overtime became common. Fatigue became unavoidable. For workers who had spent years in these conditions, the strain was real. Industrial accidents sometimes increased as exhaustion set in. Absenteeism rose in some factories, not because workers lacked patriotism, but because they were simply worn out. Even the most dedicated workers could only push themselves so far. And wartime production also transformed American cities. Industrial centers expanded rapidly as factories grew and new workers arrived. Cities like Detroit, Seattle, Oakland, and Mobile, they experienced dramatic population growth, and housing became scarce quickly. Workers sometimes lived in temporary housing or crowded apartments. Trailer parks and quickly built housing developments appeared near shipyards and aircraft factories. Schools, transportation systems, and local services struggled to keep up with the sudden growth. For many families, daily life became more stressful simply because their communities had changed so quickly. And family life? Well, family life during the war was often defined by separation. Millions of fathers, husbands, and sons were serving overseas. Women at home took on new responsibilities. They worked in factories, long hours in factories, and they managed households alone. They raised children while waiting for letters from distant battlefields. For children, the war years were often filled with absence. Some barely remembered life with their fathers before the war. For spouses, the uncertainty was constant. Every battle reported on the radio raised the same question: was my loved one there? And even in the later years of the war, the fear of casualty telegrams never disappeared. Every major battle carried the possibility of devastating news. Families who had endured years of waiting still lived with uncertainty. Some would not learn the fate of loved ones until the very end of the war. Others would receive news that changed their lives forever. These losses reminded Americans that victory, whenever it came, would not come without cost. But the home front still held the line. Because despite exhaustion, despite frustration, and despite grief, the American home front continued to function. Factories continued producing vast quantities of war material. Communities continued organizing support for soldiers overseas. And families continued writing those letters, sending care packages, and waiting for their loved ones to return. Morale may have been strained, but it did not collapse. In many ways, the endurance of the home front became one of the greatest strengths of the Allied war effort, because armies cannot fight without the support behind them. And throughout the long years of World War II, the American home front continued providing that support. I cannot tell you how many times I've personally heard from our World War II veterans on how much they needed and relied upon and appreciated the support that the home front gave to our boys overseas. One veteran in particular, Lucky Luckadoo, who I am blessed and honored to have called a friend of mine, he really would speak about the home front and how important the home front support was, not just for the morale of our soldiers, but for the weapons, for everything that you can imagine behind our boys overseas. That he said if it wasn't for the home front, he doesn't think they would have won. And so in his later years, Lucky fought hard for recognition for the home front. And now, thanks to him, we do have a National Homefront Heroes Day in May. And it's really, I'm not going to say it's easy for me to talk about the fatigue of how the home front must have felt during the war years, because I'm tired now and I've only been doing what I'm doing this summer. Granted, the past week, why you got this last episode a little late, I was blessed with some fresh local produce, and I have been nonstop working in my kitchen, canning that produce and preserving that produce so that we can have this produce for months to come. Something that the home front would have done not just during the war, but even years leading up to the war, because we had the Great Depression. So knowing how tired I am right now with everything that I am voluntarily doing, to imagine just you have to do this. I mean, in my eyes, in my mind, I have to do this because this is the lifestyle that we have. This is the lifestyle that we worked hard for and that we want. So for me, I have to do this if this is the way that I want to live. For them, they had to do it as well to live, to have plenty of food, to be able to support themselves and the war effort and to keep the home front going. So for 3 years of that, and it was almost 4, because don't forget, World War II, I'm talking 1944 in this episode. In World War II, it ended in Europe in May of 45, and it didn't end until August was when the fighting was supposed to have ended. That's when Japan surrendered, but the official surrendering was early September of 1945. So you're talking almost 4 years here in the U.S. of the home front making all the sacrifices that they needed to do. And it wasn't like, war's over, we're back to normal. It wasn't like that. There was still rationing going on. There was still our boys overseas, because then there was occupied Europe time and there was occupied Japan time. So it wasn't like war was over and our boys were home and we were no longer rationing. So rationing and getting back to normal, it took a little while. And so if you stop and think about it, you can really just imagine the exhaustion that the home front must have felt, and just tired and wondering, is it going to end? And, thankfully in 1944, we really had some battles that were won, that were crucial, that really started to turn the war into our favor on both theaters. And so I would imagine that was a morale booster for the home front as well, but that didn't make their exhaustion go away. So this episode wraps up this 5-part series that I'm really, really proud of doing. It was not the easiest series for me to talk about because you want to talk about the positive things. You want to talk about what people affiliate with the home front. But to really understand the home front, you need to see all aspects. And it was not all positive. We had struggles then, just like we have struggles now. And so these are struggles that were happening that were specifically to the wartime that the home front morale had to deal with on a daily basis. And World War II is often remembered through its great battles and military leaders, but victory depended on something else as well, and that is the resilience of millions of ordinary people. Workers who built tanks and aircrafts, families who endured years of uncertainty, communities that supported one another through grief and sacrifice. The battle for morale was fought quietly, not with weapons, but with patience and determination, and with a belief that the sacrifices being made would eventually lead to victory. The American home front was not perfect. It faced shortages, it faced divisions and exhaustion, but it endured, and that endurance helped make victory possible. This has been the Battle for Morale, America's World War II Home Front Under Pressure. I want to thank you all for tuning in, my friends. And until next time, remember, victory is in the everyday. I'll see you soon.